And thank you for putting me on such a spectacular program of people. I was sort of trying to figure out how I got to be on a program with people like Randall O'Toole and Wendell Cox and Tom Flanagan. And my theory is that I'm here so that the lower quartile of the delegates have someone that they can really connect with. So if you find yourself getting a lot out of my talk, then it's kind of a mixed blessing that I'll be very, very grateful. And especially following Randall, I'm going to play a little bit of a slight devil's advocate on why it is that we have such a draconian land use regulation and planning in this country. As Scott Reed said last night, we really have made tremendous gains. I suspect most people in this room share my view of what the size of government should be, which is a bit smaller than what it is currently. And the last 30 or 40 years have been very profitable for people with that view. You need to look no further than the idea that just 30 years ago, the government of Canada owned two competing, not airlines, but aircraft manufacturers. And a lot of people thought that was actually a good idea. I think you'd be very, very hard-pressed to float that kind of idea in today's political environment. And you can look at things like price stability of the monetary system has got a lot better over the last 20 or 30 years around the world. Company taxes go down, and a whole lot of things that we can be pleased about are out there on the political landscape, until you get to the municipal level, where we seem to be dealing with what I like to call municipal megalomania from coast to coast. We have municipal governments whose role and their conception of their own role has grown tremendously and to great detriment of people who want to basically use their land to the best of which they can find and get on with their lives. And so the first task really is to survey the landscape and understand what is happening and what its implications are, particularly for housing affordability. There's a bit of overlap with Randall there. But the second task is to, and the second task, which kind of comes out of that, is to understand what some of the solutions are. If we get the diagnosis right, then the solutions should follow fairly easily. In one sense, property rights in urban and suburban settings are fairly secure. You don't face the prospect of bands of criminals or governments, some people is not really distinguishable, coming along, taking your property wholesale. You're relatively safe. There are cases of that happening, and they tend to be quite spectacular. But by and large, that's not something that we face as other people at other times in history have. But in another sense, the right to change the use of one's property have been constrained by these long-range, comprehensive urban plans that are often more interested in whether the plan results in certain ratios being achieved on a regional basis. For example, the proportion of people catching the train or the level of density in a city, rather than serving the needs of people who actually own the individual properties. And the example I'm most familiar with at the moment is Calgary and a little bit of Saskatchewan, and I'll use those for the most part. So apologies to people from elsewhere in the country. It's just easier for me to stick to those. I'm sure we can talk about a lot of the parallels that exist later on. But Calgary over the last 8 years has gone through this process that is all too familiar around the world. It's happening in my hometown of Auckland in New Zealand at the same time. And the first step is that the government, in the case of Calgary, the province of Alberta, introduces legislation that not only empowers municipalities to undertake these kind of planning activities, but in many cases requires them to have a plan that contains certain elements, that carries over a certain period of time, and that has to be executed by people with a certain level of expertise, or certainly be part of a club of profession. The Planning and Development Act, Saskatchewan, another classic example that I'll talk about a bit more later. And so the second step, once this legislative requirement from a higher level of government is in place, is that you then have this consultational visioning exercise. In 2005, we had Imagine Calgary. And Imagine Calgary, without a hint of irony, says that We asked 18,000 people, 2% of the Calgary population, 5 questions, one of which was, what are your hopes and dreams? And they managed to go away, which it's good to have hopes and dreams. I'm just not sure it fits within the role of government to facilitate them and furnish them in the way that Calgary attempts to. They went away and they came up with a 200-page plan of goals and targets for what sort of city Calgary would be over 100 years. And so there are things about how people feel, how many people go to school, the average distance that people's food travels to get to them. This is, Plato's Republic was sort of a shorter version of this, but Calgary has really gone into tremendous detail in how people should live in this terrifyingly perfect city. And once that kind of zeitgeist was in place, that the people of Calgary choose their goals collectively, the next stage was Planet Calgary. I have to give them one thing, they have the most fantastic names. There's also currently underway Design Regina. Saskatoon recently spoke in an exercise named Saskatoon Speaks. But in Planet Calgary, it was Planet Calgary. And anyway, I just want to make sure everyone gets that it's Planet Calgary, and they're also planning it. I don't want anyone to miss that. But that is what we got to with Calgary, and of course the vision again was that Calgary would become awfully like downtown Rome or Paris, and everybody would live very close together and walk and drink a lot of coffee of high quality, and it would be this kind of urban utopia. Of course, the second part of the process is people realize that that could be very constraining, so they present 3 scenarios: compact, business as usual, and hybrid. Of course, hybrid always wins because everybody likes a compromise in Canada, and that's the popular option that tends to succeed. And so all of a sudden we have, out of Planet Calgary, a municipal development plan and a Calgary transportation plan, which tell us, for example, the density over the next 60 years should go from 20 jobs or people per hectare to 27. Why 27? Well, there is no logic behind it, but now everybody's land use decisions in Calgary are going to be affected to some extent by whether or not it gets us further away from or closer to that goal. Currently, 77% of Calgarians drive to work in a private car. That has to go down from between 65 and 55, so we're leaving a bit of leeway there, but it's clearly going to go down by about a fifth of the people that currently use private cars to get to work. And there are more and more of these goals, but you get the point. So what are the effects of this plan? Well, the most important one that we've already heard from Randall is that it has an effect on housing affordability. The plan is fundamentally about giving Calgarians the opposite of the preferences that they express in an open marketplace. So inevitably you have to have a mismatch in supply and demand, and inevitably prices have to go up. If we just use some back-of-envelope calculations using Wendell's excellent Demographia International Housing Affordability Survey, and we believe that you can, in unregulated markets, build housing for 2 to 3 years. Income, the median household income currently in Calgary, that ratio is at 4.3 years, and that gives you the result that the median house in Calgary is overpriced by somewhere a little bit over $100,000. That's $40 billion across the city. If we assume that all of the loanable funds available in Calgary actually come from Toronto, which of course is not quite true, but you could argue that there's a 5% per annum cost to the people of Calgary in holding this additional wealth in the form of housing that really is only there because of Calgarians competing with each other to secure the land that's available. So those are very ballpark figures, but already you can see that every time you buy a good or service from Calgary, you have this additional regulatory tax, and that affects people who move from Winnipeg to Calgary to change jobs. It affects everybody who is involved in the Calgary economy. We have this additional drag. And so in distorted housing markets, we also heard from Randall is that the problem is I've been so influenced by reading Randall and his books that it's kind of a lot of content here is the same, but I hope it's worth hearing again, is that higher prices have farther to fall, and so distorted housing markets are inherently less stable markets. And finally, on a social level, it puts a huge wedge between haves and have-nots. I mean, I can tell you, I'm from a city which is vastly less affordable than Calgary or Toronto or Montreal. It's not quite as bad as Vancouver. But one of the effects of that is that I now have friends scattered around the globe. And there's a variety of reasons why that is, but one of them is that we were all coming up through our 20s. We were all engineers, lawyers, and doctors, graduates, and it really is not a realistic thing. Certainly not a normal thing to buy a house in your 20s in Auckland. So as a result, our kind of little community of friends that went through high school and university together have lacking a firm anchor in Auckland, scattered around the world. And so there are some social implications of not having easily accessible home ownership that can't really be measured economically, but maybe arguably more important. So that the question is, this is obviously having a major negative effect on people's outcomes, economic, social. It's distorting the way that cities like Calgary grow. So one answer is that all of the people involved are dishonest and nefarious, and the whole thing is a large conspiracy. I think to a large extent that there is some truth in that, and I'll get to some of the reasons why I think that is. But I think we need to at least consider the possibility that actually a lot of the policy that we have is a rational response to real problems that people face. For a start, there's, and I kind of got hinted at in the last session, there's this inevitable trade-off between what I call strong property rights and weak property rights. In the first case, you have total freedom to use and dispose of your property, notwithstanding traditional common law torts. Then there's some weaker version of property rights where in an ever-widening range of externalities and perceived effects of other people's property on your property mean that everybody's property is your business, and if you believe that, then the logical way to deal with it is through collective and political processes. And of course, these externalities are probably more endemic in cities than they are in the country, because people come to countries precisely so that they can access and be adjacent to other people's property. Why would you pay more for an office on Bay Street in Toronto than you would on Main Street in Moose Jaw? Well, simply because you are in a location where you can access a lot more opportunities that basically involve other people's properties. Similarly, why would you want to buy a house in a certain neighborhood when it costs a lot more than perhaps a similar house in some other neighborhood? Well, once again, it's because it's about being located in a place where there are opportunities that involve interacting with other people and the property that they live on. Another factor which really compounds that anxiety is that housing is a little bit like education, and I got this theory that one of the reasons it's so hard to sell marketization and choice in education is that I don't mind getting a bad education so long as I know that someone else is not going to go to the super duper charter school and get a really amazing one and leave me at a disadvantage for my whole life. The point being that education is something that you can't really diversify as an investment. You get one shot. And for most people, their home is one large, undiversified investment. So they're going to put a lot of effort in ensuring against any kind of radical change. So, another externality that's very real, even if it's being created entirely by government, but it's nonetheless real in Canadian cities, is that there's a fiscal externality created by development. Municipalities, by and large, use average cost pricing for the services that they provide. And so, of course, these primitive revenue methods, including having the same mill rate tax right across the entire city, regardless of the cost of servicing different areas. With average cost pricing, though, developers have every incentive to provide housing that uses higher than average levels of service. And so, of course, what's the response to that? Well, there's political demand to then go and put quantitative restrictions on the development that happens, and that is much of what's going on in Calgary at the moment. I was at a conference where I saw Calgary's chief transportation engineer, who would best be described as a zealous kind of a chap. It was not the sort of conference that I normally go to, and I wasn't the kind of delegate that they were used to having, so I was sort of party to some quite frank conversations. And one of the things he said was, look, we have all these reasons in our church of smart growth for opposing all types of development. But the only reason we talk about infrastructure costs is it's the one thing that people of Calgary listen to. Of course, it's absurd, it's questionable that there are even are greater costs from the types of development that they oppose. And even if they are, they tend to work out being a couple of dollars a year difference for every new resident over the lifetime of the project. But nonetheless, that is a very important political reality that people see an externality from fiscal externality, that is, from more development. Another externality is the cost of open space. Why do people like to build beside the water? Because unless Jesus comes back and adds home building to his walking talents, we're not going to see water getting built out. It's possible to build housing on water, but it's very difficult. And so, on the other hand, new development in general means that you lose some of that amenity that people tend to like, which is being near open space. And finally, there's this vexed question of neighborhood character. There are two ends of the spectrum. On one end, I like to call Istanbul, and the other end is the east end of Regina. Having been to both places, I can tell you that the contrast is something that you'll probably never see as such a large contrast anywhere. But the first is bustling, it's mixed use, it never sleeps. And the second is a lot more pedestrian, with some homes in the new east end of Regina literally kilometres walk from the nearest place where you could transact with another person with actual money and actual lattes. And so we consider this beautiful passage from everyone's favorite misunderstood lefty planner, Jane Jacobs. She says, among the most admirable and enjoyable sights to be found along the sidewalks of big cities are the ingenious adaptations of old quarters to new uses. The townhouse parlor that becomes a craftsman's showroom, the stable that becomes a house, the basement that becomes an immigrant's club, the garage or brewery that becomes a theater, the beauty parlor that becomes a ground floor of a duplex, the warehouse that becomes a factory for Chinese food, the dancing school that becomes a pamphlet printer's, the cobblers that becomes a church with lovingly painted windows, and so it goes on. It sounds wonderful, and it's difficult to resist pointing out that most of the areas that planners seem to idolize today, whether it's Rosedale in Toronto, 13th Ave in Regina, Inglewood and Calgary, were all pre-1920s, before planning really took off in Canada, these organically growing areas. Nonetheless, the practical reality is that for better or worse, a lot of people seem to like living in areas like East Regina. I've talked to them, I said, it would be fantastic if you guys had a pub on the corner of the street, but they can't think of anything worse. I guess they just watch Coronation Street if they want to get that kind of stimulus. And so, we have to accept that, for at least some people, this is what they want, and there's political demand for more zoning, perhaps because they haven't heard of covenants, or perhaps it's just an easier way to get what they want. Another aspect, of course, is that, I'm not familiar with the figures, but I'm guessing I'm in pretty safe territory saying that in Istanbul, certainly the parts I visited, and in Jane Jacobs' Greenwich Village in the 1960s, the level of home ownership was somewhat lower. So today in Canada, it's 70%, and people have that undiversified asset that they're very eager to protect. And what you find is when you have a policy like in Calgary, which is intensification and trying to drive more development into existing areas, of course you get huge resistance to people having large towers and dramatic change in their neighborhood. The only place where they've really been able to do new inner city developments have been places that weren't really occupied. For example, was a large military base just south of the downtown, which has been redeveloped quite nicely, but of course no one had a really strong opinion on what it should look like prior. So, of course, it's not only a matter of rational political demand from consumers. A major factor, in my view, is that the provincial governments, as I mentioned at the start of the Calgary process, have not only allowed but required. And so even if you have a city, it's the opposite of what Randall said about Houston. even if you had a municipality that decided that they wanted to do good things, be laissez-faire, allow people to afford homes easily and have an interesting urban environment emerge, they're actually not able to do so because of a lot of the provincial legislation that puts a floor under any possible interjurisdictional competition amongst urban municipalities. And so I've talked to people from rural municipalities in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan has 500 municipalities, so some of these are quite small. Every single one of them is now required to have Calgary and Toronto planning departments come and write these extraordinary plans, which often involve paying summer students to drive around rural Saskatchewan and color in a map when they identify different types of amenity. And I've seen the letters that some of these planning consultancies have written to some of these councillors, which basically threaten them, say, you are now required to have this. If you don't do it, you're in big trouble, so you better play ball with us. And it's easy to forget that these planning consultancies, strictly speaking, are the clients of the rural municipalities. And the second is that the planning profession, and I hasten to say, before I say anything else in this speech, some of my best friends are urban planners. However, I should tell another story from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities conference, which I was at in Windsor earlier this year. We did a workshop exercise where the objective was to show planners how to show people how much linear meters of roads and pipes could be saved by more compact development. So it was fairly mundane sort of stuff. And what we had was a big picture, and we had to place these little pieces of paper which represented new houses on top of people's existing houses so that they wouldn't use up more roadway. And then the other half of the group did the opposite, where they actually put these new houses on greenfield, and then we measured how much road was required in each case so we could show people how much they could save by living on top of each other. And then we came to sort of the feedback and presentation section. And there was a woman who was probably a little bit younger than me, and she said, I'm doing my PhD in planning, so this was really fun. And the moderator said, oh, really, which scenario did you do? She said, we did greenfield, and this is a place where everyone lives in suburbia, and in this community we added a few more things. She'd drawn on that there's a monster truck rally in this community, and there's a massive big box store, and then there was some poor people in the neighborhood, but they didn't want to look at them, so they just got rid of them and put on a golf course. And the thing about it was that for her, the shape of development wasn't just about saving infrastructure. It was a total identity and way of living. This is someone who's doing a PhD in the subject. And of course, she was an outlier and an extremist. But everyone else in the room was not, because of course, if you're a good person, you live in compact development and shop at Whole Foods. And if you're a bad person, then of course you drive monster trucks, you hate the poor, and shop at big box stores. And so, my experience, this kind of attitude, while she's an extreme example, is fairly pervasive throughout the profession there. And a large part of the problem is that you have civil servants who are actually neither, and these people are absolutely convinced that they are here to save the world from climate change, from sprawl, from habitat loss, from not having enough land left to farm. They're in city halls. They're generally more organized than the elected representatives in city halls, and they're driving this agenda aided and abetted by the provincial legislation that requires them to be there. So that is a major factor, is that you've had this ideological growth that has had some fight back from people like Wendell and Randall, but also is just an absolutely massive movement from the planning schools right through to the city halls. So, if that's the basic problem, is that a combination of people's natural anxieties about life in the city and their property, infrastructural costs, and ideology on the part of the planning profession have gotten us where we are, then I guess a useful thing to say might be, what are some of the things that we can do about it? the simple way out would be to say that we stand foursquare behind strong property rights. The tort of nuisance protects you from non-trespassory incursions, and that should be enough to protect urban property from anything beyond its physical boundaries. We need a little bit more Istanbul and a little bit less Eastern Regina if we want to really enjoy our cities and make them affordable. I have real concerns over whether that is politically viable. That doesn't mean you shouldn't advocate it, but it's going to be very difficult. Whether or not it's desirable is something that I personally I think it is, but again, it has to be politically possible. So, I mean, the number one thing that municipalities could do is embrace a political bargain where people, in return for paying for the cost of the infrastructural services that cities provide at marginal cost, no longer have to be constrained by these quantitative limits on where they can build how much, what type of housing. And one obvious area for that is road pricing. It's something that's becoming more viable as technology reduces the cost of collecting payment. Of course, the great difficulty with road pricing, maybe the reason it hasn't become a lot more widespread just yet, is simply the fact that the purpose of road pricing is to reveal the prices of what people consume to the consumer. The purpose of politics, of course, is to obfuscate and obscure the prices of what people consume from the voter. And so, of course, the consumer and the voter, in this case being the same person, you can see the obvious problem. But nevertheless, as people become more and more used to technologies that track their movement, they become more and more used to making payments on a more and more transactional basis. I think that, and what I mean by that is making regular payments in small amounts very often. I think that will happen. It would be a tremendous boon for the efficiency of our traffic networks, even though it's going to be a very long political battle for it to happen. Other issues are that, of course, some provinces give municipalities the ability to set differential mill rates depending on different types of development. And there are other ways of recovering costs of development, some of which sound economically efficient, development charges and so on. They also have the difficulty that, of course, as soon as you have development charges on new houses, the existing housing stock simultaneously goes up in value, and so you have this tremendous windfall citywide, which perhaps wasn't earned. So there are difficulties in transitioning from this average cost paradigm we have to a marginal cost paradigm. But nonetheless, people who believe in property rights should be supporting these kinds of price-based mechanisms because they remove a lot of the political justification for putting regulations on what we can do with our property. The second solution is just straight up political. There needs to be a political movement to tell the planning profession that they are civil servants and their job is to facilitate people getting the kinds of housing and development that they want, not to go about setting goals which are invariably the opposite of what people want. If you were going to set a goal that people should get what they want anyway, then you wouldn't need a goal because that would already be happening. So as soon as a planner sets a goal or target for the way a city can grow, you can guarantee that they are contradicting everything that people want to come about in that city. And a third solution that's kind of already dropped out of the diagnostic section is simply removing the requirements. I mean, there's a legitimate debate about how much municipalities should be allowed to do and what the relationship between municipalities and provinces in Canada should be, but certainly removing the floor of the things that municipalities are forced to do would go a long way to at least opening up the possibility that some municipal jurisdictions may become a little bit more competitive in the way that they do their planning. And just one final thing that I'm not entirely sure I believe is a good idea, but I thought I'd stand it on at the end of my talk, is that it's worth considering that Canada reached 50% urbanization, I think, in 1921. Today we're at 81% of people living in cities. I'm not sure what it was in 1867, but I'm guessing it was substantially lower than 50%. Now, if we had been an 80%, 81% urbanized nation in 1867, I suspect we would have a very different constitutional arrangement, probably something more like what the mayor of Calgary and other very ambitious mayors in Canada would like. And that would be a much more bottom-heavy arrangement where a lot more of the taxing powers and generally the constitutional abilities would be at the municipal level. But why might we want that? It's interesting to look at the performance of the German and Swiss housing markets, which have, despite being some of the most cramped countries on the face of it, have managed to provide much higher quality, lower cost housing over a long period of time than countries like England, like Australia, New Zealand, and like parts of Canada. And the reason is not that they have particularly simplistic planning rules. Those guys love their bureaucracy. But the attitude of the local level of government is very different for the simple reason that for them, residents actually equate to revenue. Whereas if you're the city of Calgary, it's fantastic that tens of thousands of people are moving there every year and paying taxes to the province of Alberta. But for the city of Calgary, it's for the most part a major headache because their little empire, and of course every bureaucrat and politician wants to build their empire, their little empire does not grow anywhere near as much as the wider Albertan empire. And so, of course, I'm no expert in constitutional law by a long shot. Last time I suggested something like this, I said that Saskatchewan should take over its part of INAC, and I don't like that idea either. So I'm wary of this one. But I do think that one of the things that might help solve the long-term problem is that the people who are in charge of delivering the infrastructure and providing the planning rules have the opposite incentives to what we'd like them to have. They actually want to minimize growth because they see cost as much as they see additional revenue. So that really is the end of my talk. I hope that I've gone some way to explaining what some of the details of the challenge we face are, what I think some of the diagnosis might be, but also what some of the potential solutions might be as well. So thank you very much everyone for listening. I'm happy to take questions.